Thank you so much, Lou, and it's great to be here. It's SCSP's first year at Foresight, so we're really happy to have you or to be here. Very quickly on who we are then, since we're new to this group. SCSP, or the Special Competitive Studies Project, is a 3-year nonpartisan nonprofit initiative that comes out of 2 different lineages. The first, in the 1950s, there was a project called the Special Studies Project, which was designed to think about American competitiveness vis-a-vis the Soviet Union across a range of different facilities. And then more recently, Congress had mandated a National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, the NSCAI, that was trying to think about how national security was being impacted by the emerging AI phenomenon. Eric Schmidt was the chair of that commission, and in the final chapter of the final report of the NSCAI, they tell a story of a wider range of emerging technologies that are impacting our world, our national security. So this is a 3-year initiative, time-bound, designed to think about how a broader set of emerging technologies are impacting both our security, but also the competitiveness of the United States and democracies around the world. My team, the Future Tech Platforms team, is thinking about those technologies themselves and how we build national technology strategy for the United States. What that really entails, and why we need one, is thinking about something that's fairly common to everyone here. Gaps that don't get us from the lab to the field, gaps that prevent us from going from R&D to commercialization, often seen here in the Valley of Death that we're all deeply familiar with, the breakdowns in the funding chains. And these are problems, obviously. They kill good ideas, they go to purgatory forever, it delays timelines, does not get to the field to have the societal good, to be able to change our lives and help the progress that we've been talking about this weekend. Now, that in and of itself is an issue, but we see it becoming more of an issue in the coming days for 2 main reasons. First is we see, and places like Foresight and people here really foresaw, that we're standing on the precipice of a wide range of technological change beyond what we're used to. We have waves of general purpose technologies that have changed the lifetime, or changed across the lifetimes of human existence. And we're on the cusp of another one today, where we've seen largely digital in the past 30 years, but now we're seeing the edge of a new big shift in technologies. We call it the ABCs of tech. That if you think where a lot of the focus has been digital, the bits, we're now moving to the atoms, the physical realm, the bits, the digital realm, and the cells, the biotechnical realm. It's in the convergence of those technologies that we think there's going to be a massive change to our society, to our security, to our economy, to our daily lives. And that just amplifies the funding problems that we've been talking about before. For a lot of the reasons that Gabriel was talking about a second ago, it's easier to do a software as a service company with low investment, quicker timelines. The ability to invest in these things require more upfront capital, often longer timelines. So how do we bridge that gap to ensure timely, continuous funding? Because we want to make sure that these technologies are getting out for the betterment of our society and our world. But there's a second reason it matters, and we are talking about risk. We're supposed to be balancing it this weekend, tech risk and existential hope. And there's a lot of risks that we've been discussing this weekend, but one of them is there is a competition underway as to what model of governance will win the 21st century. Will it be human rights-centered democracy, or will it be techno-authoritarianism? And we see that as a central challenge. And technology is at the heart of it because it facilitates so much else. What are the values that are being baked into our technology and baked in at the beginning rather than regulated later? What are the questions of who benefits economically and shows that their system can deliver for people good jobs, good opportunities for their families? And we have to think also about the national security and defense implications of technology, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year showed us that that's not something that's just a historical concern that we have to think about. So there is a contest of models out there in terms of how technology is being used. And when you look at the way that technologies come together, we see this idea of a tech spheres of influence that are being put out there through these models, where you pull together different aspects of the tech stack, and then that leads you to a significant influenced by having technology. And the lack of technology or technology gaps that we discussed in our most recent report then matter as well for a state's ability to defend its population and advance its interests and values around the world. So the model matters, and being able to compete matters. Now, what does that mean for funding? If we think back, we've had some pretty successful funding models as a country in terms of giving us economic advantage, but that's changed. We've seen change first and foremost in our R&D percentages. As you see here, if you go back to say the 50s, 60s, 70s, you'd have a government supplying R&D funding, government also as a customer of R&D, the prime customer for advanced technologies when it came out. That obviously has changed. Private sector is funder, private sector is also the main customer they're thinking about. So the focus of our technology has changed. And that can be entirely okay. That can be great. The American private sector obviously is an engine of innovation that's bringing us so much of the progress that we talked about earlier today in terms of where we were even 30 years ago to now.
What was other on this chart? Is it like a non-profit or?
Yeah, it would be nonprofit, that kind of. So the challenge, though, is we've seen a decline as we've seen the private sector take on more of the funding responsibility for R&D. There's been a corporate decline in research. I mean, pretty shockingly, if you think about it, compared to 1950 to 2015, almost 50% decline in what's going to research. The character of it has also changed in terms of our R&D, what's going into basic research and who's funding basic research, applied research questions, and then development. So we see here a heavy shift to business, private sector funding a lot more of the R&D chain. Again, could be fine if it was investing in the things that we see as a nation we need. But even though they are doing a lot of wonderful, moving mountains in terms of innovation, when we look at what the nation might need versus what the investment is going to, we see a gap emerging. So if you just think about that blue chunk right there, telecommunications, networking, computer hardware, materials, energy, significant portion of what even VCs were investing in the 1980s. Much smaller portion in 2015, 2019. Now think about that in the context of recent things in the news the past 4 or 5 years. Questions of exportable 5G hardware in the United States and Europe and Huawei as a provider. Think about this past summer of the need for semiconductor resilience and a $52 billion federal investment in the Chips and Science Act. Think about questions of our shift to electric vehicles for a lot of reasons across the world, but significant supply chain when it comes to critical earths or critical minerals, rare earths, elements, battery production, especially lithium ion, in select choke point countries around the world. So what we used to invest in a lot to stay at the cutting edge, we invest in less now at a time that it's only more important today. That adds up to a bigger picture that we see. We call it the new geometry of innovation. That if you think back historically, there used to be post 1945, the idea of a triangle of innovation that Vannevar Bush first pioneered. The idea that you had funding flows for R&D, for innovation, coming from the government as a central node, going to academia to perform basic research, going to industry as well, which then also was self-funding, and a lot of the corporate labs that we're doing. That has become very different in our modern environment. That triangle still exists, but it's been supplemented in a variety of ways that matter significantly. First of all, the triangle exists, but the weight of each of those pieces of the triangle has changed. So government, as we talked about a moment ago, has become a less weighty funder of research and development. Industry also not investing as much in its own R&D going forward. Academia, still a leading sector when it comes to performing research. Also, government is an actor there if you think about the national labs. But not as much as in the past. in terms of where the funding is coming from, where the work is being done. So that's how the bottom half of this new, more complex mapping has changed since past 40 years. Add into that new nodes that make the geometry, this polygon we see, more complicated. We have private capital of strain best represented by venture, but not exclusively venture, high impact family or high net wealth families, impact investing, these kind of things that are also happening in the private sector as an actor, and startups where a lot of the new innovation is happening as opposed to big industrial corporate labs. We have the rise of the crowd in a web-enabled way. That is something that's still a novel and emerging phenomenon, whether that's made possible by fast grants, which kind of top-down ability to fund research in a timely manner, whether it's DAOs and the ability to kind of go from bottom up. And then with the entire DeSci movement, you don't have to be in an academic lab or a corporate lab. So what we have is a much more complicated geometry of innovation, a lot more nodes, a lot more actors, and that have changed since how people, especially in the public policy world we come from in DC, think about this ecosystem. Now, we shouldn't then be surprised that a lot of the technologies that we were just talking about a second ago, when we look at the slide of venture investing in the 80s to now venture investing today, a lot of the technologies that we care about investing or being invested in aren't getting the full attention of this geometry because there's new actors that don't connect as naturally to each other. There's a lot of latent power here, but the ecosystem isn't organized naturally to think about some of those big national technology priorities that may not be the quickest returns, the most lucrative returns, but matter in our daily lives. So what we're trying to do is think of ways that we can better organize and bring together in a voluntary manner these actors to pursue some of those priorities for the United States and for like-minded partners around the world. And our approach to this is thinking about how could the United States have a national technology strategy process that would voluntarily bring together public and private actors to better pursue those national missions, to better pursue those technologies, whether it's select software like artificial intelligence, whether it's next generation networks beyond 5G, or questions of bioeconomy that we've talked about this week, new energy generation, convergent manufacturing, or issues of compute, hardware, semiconductors, microelectronics. All those areas that are getting underfunded we see, but if you had a national technology process, could we then find good ways to public-private partner to unlock capital toward those areas that have not been as well supported as we think is necessary? So just to walk through what we think this process would entail, because we'd love to talk about it and hear your feedback, your thoughts, how we can make it even better. We have the idea of a national study process that builds a horizon scanning network that draws on the great talents of organizations like Foresight, but people who are in that world, who are looking beyond the bend to think about what critical technologies are essential today, tomorrow, and how to identify them in a timely manner, that there's some kind of strategic or national significance to that technology. Then move to a phase of curation. The idea that sometimes we need technology action plans where the ecosystem is not actually working to deliver a better advantage. AI, for instance, we've seen a lot of great work because of the way that the market's oriented around software. But how do we make sure that there's new innovation going into compute, to biotech, that, as we heard a couple minutes ago, can have that 7, 10, 15-year timeline that's going to have longer stretched out returns. So a curation phase, we think about those technologies that really are strategic and need the attention, and think about what public policy levers could help incentivize public-private cooperation, whether it's questions of regulation, questions of sufficient infrastructure, questions of talent pipelines, make sure that we have enough qualified talent in the space. And then we see moving on to a resourcing phase for those technologies. How do we then go and bring together both public and private resources in a forum to think about de-risking through grants, matching capital, other ideas, but also simply things as information sharing. The idea that, as we've seen here, there's a lot of very interesting things going on in these tech spaces. But if you're not a VC or if you're not an investor that specializes in those areas, it can be a high barrier entry knowledge-wise to understanding what's happening there, to understand the risk, to then feel it's okay to make that investment. So how do we think about information sharing? How do we think about capital stack mapping in a way that we can help understand and provide clarity of where there are entry and exit points for those long timelines that people might be thinking about? So that would then fold into an implementation phase where we would then see a national mission manager, as we like to call them, thinking about these things, having oversight of them to make sure that balls aren't dropped, that everyone in these public-private partnerships are pushing forward if people can't fulfill a role, to making sure holes are plugged. So that's the process that we are thinking about to help us organize this new geometry of innovation that we've seen change. But we'd love to hear from you. That's why we're really excited to be at Foresight, to understand first and foremost, in addition to any questions you have about the process, about our diagnosis of the new geometry of innovation, what nodes in the ecosystem might you be seeing from where you're sitting that we didn't capture in those 5? What is working really well that should be replicated? What is not working but is band-aided? So I'll stop there. I'd love just to have a great conversation.
Well, what do you think of the vision?
Yeah.
Maybe you say you showed the slide with the VC fund. Where do you see this? And also the full landscape of
Where do we see like venture capital's role in that?
which sectors they investing in? China investing in
So we see already changes happening in the ecosystem. So you've had a lot of venture, I think, based in digital for the reasons I discussed in your presentation, that you can have relatively quick over a 10-year venture fund returns. You can also have high returns with low capital expenditures upright if you're thinking software as a service mentality. But we need more in areas like microelectronics. We need more in next generation energy. We need more in advanced manufacturing. So those kind of areas. And we're really excited and happy to see that there are venture capital funds who are stepping into that role. There are some really wonderful deep tech venture funds out there. We're always excited to learn about more of them, but ones that are thinking specifically in 15 to 20-year timelines, thinking about things that have high capital expenditures upfront and really harnessing a lot of patient capital that sees both economic and other value add in investing in these areas as part of their mission statement. So we think there is part of venture moving into that space, but part of the reason we want to think about a resourcing mechanism to the strategy process that then pulls together venture with other actors is we don't think this, because of these long timelines, is something that necessarily venture can solve on its own. So how can we pair venture with other actors, private equity, philanthropy, foundations, to help create a map with those tangible on-roads and off-roads that help people feel comfortable in investing.
What is the big change? What do you expect?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a naive question. It's a question that's at the heart of what we're doing. So we have a couple theories of change. First and foremost is we are putting forward tangible policy recommendations, like in a report that we launched in September, and then a report my team just launched 2 weeks ago now, that fleshes out what this strategy process looks like if it were to be adopted in legislation or by the executive branch, where we have examined different models of what a government organization might look like that performs this role. So there's an education mission that we're doing to put forward what we think can be really actionable proposals that can get picked up and acted on. Second, though, is really pulling together public and private to have conversations in a way that we felt were not sufficiently robust in Washington, to make sure that we're looking beyond things that are urgent, crowding out the important when it comes to tech. You know, the three examples I just mentioned in terms of 5G, semiconductors right now, like Washington is acting on all those, but we need to be getting better at talking to the tech community and understanding what is over the horizon and not being focused on what's happening right now. We're in a reactive posture. So if we can have better connective tissue and we can help facilitate that to have those conversations, that actually will bring about change where we can identify early. And then if the other proposals we're talking about, then that will give an actual mechanism for the early identified technologies to then have action on them. Yeah.
Wonder how how that might help. So first, like you are acting as a building. Said, like, sense of the stakeholders. When deeper inside the line, municipality, there's already a sort of DC potential for production, aligning that small businesses.
Yeah, no, I endorse, I don't know, everything you just said in the sense of we see a lot of potential in biotechnology because of its distributed nature, because of the resilience that brings, because of the pro-democratic principles that we think that helps foster by bringing it down to the local level. And that means engaging much more with state municipal actors in a way that government on this chart can't just be federal government representing R&D, representing procurement, the way that we shorthand think about it from 50, 60 years ago. It should be thinking about procurement of these technologies that have wider national competitiveness by local and state governments. It should be thinking about state investments in those infrastructures, in communities, in community colleges and training programs that happen at the state level, in addition to federal funding to provide support. One of the things that we think a lot now is we can talk a lot about technology strategy. We can talk about, federal ideas for innovation, but that has to happen in a place. That has to happen somewhere tangibly on the ground, especially if we're talking about physical technologies, right? So that has to be something that we focus on. And actually, my colleague in the back there, David, is leading that line of effort for us, thinking about the place where things actually happen. What is it like to take the tech strategy that might be happening at one level and then marry it to an economic plan that is carried out in an actual locale?
So,
Yeah.
the economic development. We've had a conversation. I know implementing a 4-year strategy. For developing about certain complex benefits. And if you're lacking it, it's like the valley of death between the federal level and the municipality level. We've got a history of that. Stakeholders. But we know that there are these kinds of folks from here are conversation. White House, it's not clear what kind of
Yeah, no, I think building that robustness, we think about private-public partnership that we're talking about. A lot of it is thinking about how do you build that connectivity thread between the public and the private, but we shouldn't ignore, which is, I think, your really important point, that there's connectivity threads in the federal system to be built between different parts of the public too, between federal, between the state, between the local. And we're thinking about in our process, how do you build that kind of horizontal connectivity? And we can't ignore, and this is great to make sure that we don't ignore the vertical connectivity within the public side of the PPP. how do we, when we're talking about an organization that can carry out tech strategy process, make sure we're not just getting a better private insight in terms of understanding technology, but how are we getting better non-federal public insight into where that technology can live, where certain municipalities or states are ahead of the curve in being able to understand this could be a place for this innovation to occur. So a PPP would have to both strengthen the private public, but also the communications in the public itself. Yeah.
I apologize. That's something that you covered. So I don't know if you're familiar with the mission economy by.
Yes.
How much is like this kind of an overlap with her ideas that are also like inspiring like a lot of like EU policies like as programs. The overlap basically this concept and
So I think there's a lot of overlap in the sense that we both are shooting at the same problem, that we have amazing innovation ecosystems and we're excited and trying to understand better how we've gotten that innovation, but it's not always the innovation that we need. You know, for Mazzucato, she's thinking about health, she's thinking about climate mainly. So those are the kind of things she talks about mission economy. And we're thinking also about those, but we're all thinking about national security, national competitiveness. So I would say it's a very similar diagnosis of what is causing the issue. And then the solutions we're proposing to tackle are different domains of a multifaceted problem.
But so even if the domains are different, like the tools are also somewhat overlapping.
Yes, yes. And one of the things that we think about that, is at the heart of mission economy is there will be times when the government or another actor, but probably the government, can step in and define a moonshot that should be taken and mobilize public and private around that in a very tangible, goal-setting way. It won't be everything because with these kind of general purpose technologies we're talking about, so much of this is a race for diffusion to a wide range of activities. But at the heart of that can be in certain instances, moonshots, and her work on moonshots obviously leading in terms of how you think about principles for building scoped moonshots that have good societal buy-in, that serve a wide range of the community's interests. So yes, we see moonshots as one of the core ways you can approach it. And obviously that's really important to her work, central to her work. Yeah.
So, I mean, like her ideas how they influence the EU programs, and they face like a lot of implementation challenges. I actually don't know the details. Like, do you know the details of like an as those actual like attempts to implement this on the EU level? And I think also like in the Netherlands, there are other experiments on this as well. Like, because like on paper, this like it's all like. Yeah, like it's always sounds really good. I think the implementation is really the challenge. But has that also informed parts of your strategy? How do you plan to implement it?
Yes, and I think she very helpfully distinguishes, and this may be some of the challenge that you've seen in implementation, the cases that you're talking about. What level of moonshot are you pursuing? Are you pursuing a more technologically oriented moonshot where you're solving a specific tech problem, or are you pursuing a societal problem that the technology moonshot is designed to get you to overcome, with the latter of those two being much more challenging? So when we think about implementation, we're thinking about tech moonshots, I would say, are a little more in that first category, thinking about ways that you can have very targeted moonshots that are solving a specific tech challenge that then can be coupled with other approaches, other strategies to support diffusion and think about those aspects rather than the moonshot necessarily being the one way to think about it. So implementation, I would say we're not just thinking about moonshots itself. Yeah.
We want to before maybe get started there. In this case,
Right, yeah. So yeah, synthetic cell would be great again, actually, in terms of how do you think about, okay, clearly an organization, and we've heard it separately as well, synthetic cell. So you have some, a tech person like yourself, or like some other people we've heard from, say the synthetic cell has certain properties that make it worthwhile to pursue. We've identified biotechnology as the key sector. So that in of itself, an example of kind of the study phase, bringing that to the attention. So in the first box, we've now seen this is a critical technology because of the knock-on effects it's going to have for the bioeconomy, because we think the bioeconomy is important. We then move to the curation phase of, okay, what do we need to do to make the synthetic cell happen? And in that case, there may be fewer public policy levers you need to pull in the immediate, compared to something like drones or things, AV or autonomous vehicles, the number of public policy levers you might need to pull, smaller bucket. You're not thinking about changing regulations for airspace. You're not thinking about changing those kind of things. So you then see, okay, what public policy levers might be necessary though to incentivize the return? That'd be different. So are there ones that are relevant in the synthetic cell category that would then make the end result of the project more commercializable, more available? And then finally, what kind of resourcing options would you then look to support something like a synthetic cell? Is it maybe, and here we are agnostic in the sense of we don't have a preset path where every specific platform project would have to go through certain phases of resourcing. Maybe here, a research consortium that's matched by public dollars could be a good way to pull people together, because there might be a less immediate commercial return from the synthetic cell itself. It's more, once you have that unlocked, what can you then go do with it as a private actor? So that might be a better model for that, as opposed to then saying, okay, we have a very specific process of first we get ventures together, then we get private equity or industry. So I think that's a way to walk through it of very bespoke. Just my 2 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the separate. Yeah.